Dark Souls 2 is the lost middle child of the Souls family. Abused and neglected, it is either completely ignored or torn down to be unworthy of the name. For me, however, it is the entry that feels the most different. Sometimes those differences are fantastic and fresh, sometimes they fall short, but it always feels like a game that has an ambition to be unique, and if nothing else, that makes it interesting. Welcome to Wreckpoint. My name's Dan, and let's see why you should fight your way through the kingdom of Drangleic. Dark Souls 2 was developed by From Software and was released in 2014. However, for this video I will be specifically talking about the Scholar of the First Sin edition, which bundled in all of the DLC and changed up some of the enemy AI and placement. One of the first things you'll notice if you look into the history of Dark Souls 2 is that there were many reports that this was a side project for the studio, with Miyazaki having less of a role in its development than both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. This is the root of a lot of criticisms around Dark Souls 2. Any of the major changes made to the game from its predecessors are immediately attributed to a mistake or a misunderstanding of what Dark Souls is, as opposed to a creator trying to either improve or mix up their formula. These changes aren't given a chance. Now, there are many places that you can see a comprehensive rebuttal to these criticisms, some being very long and very successful YouTube videos. As such, I will not be making this video from a defensive stance. Instead, I'm just going to tell you why I think Dark Souls 2 is a game that you should play. Dark Souls 1 is a game where every single action you make should be made with thought and consideration. Dark Souls 2 is even more demanding in this field. SS flasks take longer to drink, weapons are more damaging but often slower than those in Dark Souls, and the amount of enemies in any given area is much higher. A common tactic in the other Souls games is to leash one enemy at a time, get them away from their friends, kill them, rinse and repeat until the room is empty. This is not as viable in Dark Souls 2. There are more enemies and they are less willing to leave their friends. This results in combat situations where you must juggle a lot of enemies at a time, an additional layer that makes the game considerably more difficult, but also makes every encounter more tactical and more intense. Stamina plays an even larger role because getting caught in the middle of a group of enemies without the ability to escape is a death sentence. You have to be constantly aware of your surroundings because an attack could come from anywhere at any time. This managing of enemies is incredibly satisfying, and the game equips you with the tools you need to deal with it. For example, life gems are consumable healing items that you can use while still on the move, kiting enemies. And they heal you over time, which is less of a burden when facing a lot of less powerful attacks, as opposed to the more high damage single attacks found in the other Souls games. Furthermore, larger weapons are more likely to have sweep attacks in this game, and you have the ability to dual wield weapons. Not only does this give you the ability to deal with large groups of enemies swiftly, it also means that the number of possible loadouts goes up exponentially. Now, all of this talk about groups of little enemies does not mean that there aren't some big boys for you to take down too. Some of the boss fights do pit you against larger groups of enemies like in the rest of the game, but these are not the standouts, and honestly they don't quite manage to differentiate themselves from the rest of the game. There are also a considerable amount of the bosses that are big dudes in armor. That's not really a problem. You see, each of the big dudes in armor are different, and not just in how big they are, but in the kind of challenge they provide. I mean, the Ruined Sentinels and the Fume Knight are technically both big dudes in armor, but they are also completely different in what they ask of the player. The Ruined Sentinels require careful consideration of the environment as you fight them on precarious platforms, while the Fume Knight is a belter of a boss fight, highly damaging and variable attacks that have very little wind up. It is one of the most difficult bosses in the Souls series, but it never feels unfair. So yes, there are a lot of big dudes in armor to fight, but they are variable and there are just a lot of bosses in Dark Souls 2. Some of which aren't big dudes in armor, but actually scratch that itch to take on a bombastic and monstrous creature, like Sin, a dragon fight to compete with Calamite. These fights are satisfying and provide that flavour of majesty that is particular to the Souls games. The boss fights are even further improved by their context. Dark Souls 2 is very much a game about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You aren't the chosen undead anymore, you are the bearer of the curse. You travel to Drangleic to try and cure yourself of it. The events that transpire thereafter are epic and elaborate, but the core goal of your character was always simple: cure yourself. In every way, this game feels like that. The rise and fall of an empire through the lens of personal stories. King Ventric is the centerpiece of this narrative, but he's a tragic character, and the game allows you to more directly explore the betrayals, war and subterfuge of this world. Much like the other games, it bolsters this with a phenomenal sense of atmosphere. The music, the characters, the world all feed into this layer of fog that consumes the player. Unlike the other games, there's a single shaft of light that pierces this fog into the game, a twinkle of hope that is hard to nail down. Perhaps it's the aesthetic of the game. Beautiful but muted, the first location you visit is Majula, a run-down and sad place but situated on a gorgeous shoreline bathed in the light of a setting sun. Each area in this game has its own identity, but they're all fantastic to look at. Whether it be the oppressive darkness of the caves, the intricate architecture of the castles, or the stunning skies over the Dragon Eyrie. They're all beautiful to behold, but in their own way. Dark Souls 2 will always be a controversial game in the Souls community. It is inexorably different from its family. In some ways that can be frustrating, and it definitely demands a different kind of approach. It wants the player to tackle it on its own terms. This means it provides a different kind of experience than the other Souls games, while still having fantastic combat, an ever-present sense of dread, and a world that demands to be unravelled. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a trip to Drangleic as soon as you can, or if you've already played it, let me know where you stand on this debate in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for a new game recommendation every week. Dark Souls 2 is a highly contested game, but I love it, and I'm happy to sing its praises whenever I can. Next week we're delving back into the world of future Nazis, and I've got a special project to show you folks.